The cottage sat at the end of a stone path, half hidden behind a garden of lavender and wild thyme, and I knew before I knocked that she was inside. 3 years of wrong roads and cold trails and the smell of salt wind and dried lavender haunting me at odd hours, in the middle of council, in the silence before sleep, once while standing in a rainstorm outside and in 600 miles from home, because something in my chest pulled south and would not stop. My wolf had learned a new trick in those 3 years, an ache behind my ribs that went quiet only when I was moving toward her, and howled, not in any way the court could hear, but in a low, relentless hum against the inside of my bones when I turned away. I did not knock immediately. I stood on that stone path with the sea wind pulling at my cloak and the late afternoon sun warm on the cliff, and I let myself feel the full weight of what I had done. Because the last time I had stood this close to Wren, I had been a king who believed duty outweighed destiny. I had chosen a political alliance over the pull in my chest, and she had left my hall between one dawn and the next, and every morning since had tasted like ash. I knocked. The door opened, and there she was. She looked different. Not older, 3 years is nothing to our kind, but steadier. The uncertainty that had lived around her edges at Thornmere was gone. Her dark hair was braided back with a strip of linen, her sleeves pushed past her elbows, her hands stained green from some herb I could not name. She looked at me the way she had always looked at me, directly, without flinching, without the practiced deference my court had perfected. "Thuron," she said, "not my king, not Alpha. Just my name, the way she had said it exactly once before, the day she arrived at Thornmere, before anyone told her she was not supposed to. Rend." She studied me for a moment, the traveled dust on my cloak, the horse tied at the garden gate, the 3 years carved into whatever she read on my face, and then she said, "I thought you might come eventually." She did not invite me in. "There is an inn at the end of the harbor road," she said. "Marin keeps it. Tell her you need a room and that you will work for it. She does not take charity, and neither does this village." Then she closed the door. Not hard, not in anger. The way you close a door when you have bread rising and herbs to dry, and a life that does not include a king standing on your path. I stood there for a long time after the latch clicked. The bondache behind my ribs had gone quiet for the first time in 3 years, perfectly, beautifully quiet, like the silence after a storm, and I understood that I could lose it again in an instant if I did this wrong. I went to find the inn. Marin was a broad-shouldered woman in her 60s with hands like oak roots and a gaze that missed nothing. She looked at my horse, my cloak, the sword I had not bothered to hide, and said, "Soldier." "Something like that. The roof above the stable needs patching. You can start there. Room is yours as long as you are useful." I patched the roof. It took the rest of the afternoon, and by the time I climbed down, my palms were raw and the sunset was painting the harbor in shades of copper and rose. Brindleshore was a small village, 30, perhaps 40 families, built along a curve of coastline where the cliffs dropped to a sheltered cove. The houses were warm sandstone with slate roofs, weathered by salt wind, and every garden seemed to grow something useful: herbs, vegetables, climbing roses that served as windbreaks. It was the kind of place that survived by being good to each other, because no one else was going to do it for them. It was the kind of place Wren would choose. I ate alone in the inn's common room that night: fish stew, brown bread, a mug of cider that tasted of apples and sea air. And I thought about how I had come to be sitting in a stranger's inn, 6 weeks' ride from my own hall, with plastered dust in my hair and a bondache in my chest that had driven me across half the continent. I will tell you how I lost her. Wren arrived at Thornmere 3 years and 8 months before I found her door in Brindleshore. She came as a records keeper, the daughter of a minor Pax archivist who had died the previous winter, leaving her with no standing, no protector, and a talent for organization that my steward recognized and my court ignored. She was 24. I was 31, and I had been Alpha King of Thornmere for 6 years, long enough to have stopped noticing people who were not useful to me. I noticed her. It happened in the Great Hall on a Tuesday afternoon. She walked in carrying a stack of bound ledgers, trade records my steward had asked her to reorganize, and she set them on the long table near the window where the light was best, and she opened the first one, and I stopped hearing what my commander was saying about the eastern border. Something in my chest shifted. Not painfully, it was closer to the feeling of a key turning in a lock you did not know was closed. a warmth behind my ribs, faint and persistent, like sunlight coming through a crack in a wall. My wolf, who had been silent and restless for years, went still in a way I had never felt, not the stillness of sleep, but the stillness of recognition. I told myself it was nothing. She was a records keeper. She had no pack standing, no family alliance to offer, no political value. She was quiet and precise, and she organized my archives with a thoroughness that bordered on ruthlessness. I found out later she had discarded an entire shelf of duplicate tax records that 3 previous archivists had been too afraid to touch, and she did not bow the way my court bowed. She inclined her head briefly, as if acknowledging that I existed, and then she returned to whatever she was doing. I should have known then. A woman who does not bow to a king because she is too busy being competent is either a fool or a force, and Wren was no fool. But I was. Because my council had spent 2 years urging a match with the Ashenmore pack, a powerful northern clan whose alliance would secure my western border and double my trade routes. And their alpha's daughter, Lady Rivna, was everything a political marriage required. Beautiful, well-connected, ambitious, and willing. My counsel was practical. The bond chooses when it chooses, my chief advisor, Halden, told me when I sat too long in the hall one evening, watching the light move across Wren's bent head as she worked. You cannot wait for a feeling, my king. The kingdom needs an alliance. He was not wrong. Ashenmore's strength would have protected Thornmere for a generation. The numbers were clear, the strategy sound, and Rivna was a capable woman who understood what a political match required. She did not love me and I did not love her, and we both understood that was not the point. I chose duty. The announcement was made at the autumn feast, torches burning in the great hall, the long tables full, the court assembled. I stood before my people and declared my intention to wed Rivna of Ashenmore, and the hall erupted in approval because it was the right strategic move, because it made sense, because it was what a king was supposed to do. Wren was there. She stood near the back of the hall, beside the archway that led to the records room, holding a sheaf of grain inventory tallies she had been bringing to the steward. She was wearing the same plain dress she always wore, dark blue, mended at the cuffs, clean and pressed. She heard the announcement. She looked at me once, not with hurt, not with accusation, but with a kind of quiet clarity, as though she had always known this was coming and had simply been waiting to be proven right. She inclined her head once. Then she turned and walked back through the archway, and I heard the records room door close behind her with a soft, precise click. That was the last time I saw her for 3 years. She left between one dawn and the next. No one noticed, that is the honest truth of it, the part that shames me most. A records keeper with no pack standing, no family, no allies in the court. She was invisible. She had always been invisible to everyone except me, and I had chosen to look away. She left a single note on her desk in the records room, weighed down with a smooth river stone. 5 words in her careful, slanted hand. I wish you well, my king. No plea, no accusation, no anger. Just the quiet dignity of a woman who had understood her situation perfectly and had decided to leave before anyone could decide for her. I found the note 3 days later, when I went to the records room looking for a trade document and discovered her desk empty, her shelves in perfect order, every ledger labeled and filed. She had finished her work before she left. Even in leaving, she had been thorough. The warmth behind my ribs, which I had been ignoring for months, turned into something else that morning. It became a blade, thin and cold, and lodged between my lungs, and it did not move. I married Rivna 2 months later. The marriage lasted 8 months. That is not Rivna's fault. She held up her end of the bargain. She was intelligent, composed, and she managed the alliance with Ashenmore exactly as promised. She did not pretend affection where none existed, and neither did I, and for a time I thought that was enough. It was not enough. The bondache grew worse. Some mornings I woke with the scent of lavender and salt wind so strong in my lungs that I crossed the room before I was fully awake, reaching for something that was not there. My wolf, who had been silent since the night of the feast, began a low hum, not a howl, not a growl, but a vibration deep in my chest that would not stop, that responded to nothing Rivna did or said, that only shifted, just barely, just enough for me to feel the direction when I faced south. Rivna noticed. She was perceptive, I will give her that. You have a bond, she said one evening, standing in the doorway of my study with her arms crossed. Not angry, she was rarely angry, practical even in this. Not with me, with someone else. I did not answer, because there was no answer that was not a confession. I will return to Ashenmore, she said. The alliance will hold, but I will not live as the second choice of a man whose wolf howls for another woman in the middle of the night. She left the following week. The alliance held as she promised. The marriage dissolved without ceremony, without scandal. Rivna was too proud for scandal, and I was too ashamed. And then I was alone in Thornmere, in a hall that smelled of stone and candle smoke and nothing like lavender, and the blade between my ribs twisted and my wolf faced south, and I understood what I had done. I searched for 2 years. Not publicly. I could not announce that the Alpha King of Thornmere was tearing the countryside apart looking for a former records keeper he had been too foolish to claim. I searched quietly with my own resources, following traces so faint they were barely there. A trader in the river towns remembered a woman matching her description, dark-haired, quiet, carrying a leather satchel of books. She had passed through 18 months earlier, heading south. A village healer in the Midlands recalled teaching herb craft to a young woman with no pack scent who learned faster than anyone she had ever trained. A fisherman on the southern coast thought he had seen someone like her walking the cliff path above Brindleshore, but he could not be sure. I followed every lead. Most ended nowhere. I rode through storms and slept in barns and ate in roadside inns, and my court began to worry. Halden sent letters that grew increasingly pointed, reminding me that a kingdom required a king and not a ghost who rode south every fortnight. I did not tell Halden what I was looking for. He would not have understood. He was the one who had told me the bond could wait, that duty came first, that a records keeper was not a match for a king. He had been wrong, and I had been the fool who listened, but I could not explain that to him without explaining what the ache behind my ribs had cost me, and I did not have the words. I found her on a warm afternoon in late spring, in a village that smelled of salt and wild thyme, because the ache behind my ribs went quiet for the first time in 3 years, and I followed the silence like a compass. That first night at the inn in Brindleshore, I did not sleep. I lay on a narrow bed above the stable and listened to the sea against the cliffs and felt the bond humming, not aching, not howling, just humming, steady and warm, because she was 200 yards away and that was close enough for my wolf to stop its relentless pulling. In the morning, I patched the rest of the roof. Then I mended a fence behind the inn. Then I carried a delivery of flour sacks from the harbor to the village baker, a man named Corwin who talked more than any person I had ever met, and who did not seem to notice or care that I was not talking back. By midday, I had earned my room and a reputation as a quiet stranger who was handy with tools. By the afternoon, I had an excuse to walk past Wren's cottage. Her shop, if you could call it that, occupied the front room of the cottage. Shelves of dried herbs in labeled jars, bundles of lavender and chamomile hanging from the ceiling beams, a work table covered in mortar and pestle marks and the green stain of 100 crushed leaves. A wooden sign above the door read Brindleshore, herbalist in hand-carved letters that looked like Wren's handwriting made solid. She was inside, wrapping a bundle of something for a village woman who held a fussing infant on her hip. I watched through the open doorway as Wren measured a pinch of dried chamomile into a small linen sachet, tied it closed, and handed it over with instructions I could not hear. The woman smiled, shifted the baby, and left through the side garden. Wren looked up and saw me standing in the doorway. "If you have come to stare," she said, "the cliff walk has better views. I came to see if you needed anything carried." She considered me for a long, measured moment. Then she said, "There are 3 crates of dried rosemary at the harbor. Corwin was supposed to bring them up this morning, but Corwin talks more than he carries." I carried the crates. They were heavy, packed tight, bound with rope, and by the time I set the 3rd one on her shop floor, my shoulders burned and my hands smelled of rosemary and salt. "Thank you," she said, "nothing more." She turned back to her work. I went back to the inn. This became the shape of my days. I woke early, did whatever work Marin needed, and then found reasons to be near Wren's cottage, carrying deliveries, mending the stone wall along the cliff path, helping Corwin unload fishing boats at the harbor. I did not push. I did not knock on her door uninvited. I did not mention Thornmere or the bond or the 3 years of searching. I worked and I waited and I let the village decide what to make of me. The village decided slowly. A week passed before the fishermen stopped falling silent when I approached the harbor. 2 weeks before Marin's daughter, a sharp-eyed girl of 19 named Tess, stopped watching me like I might steal the cutlery. 3 weeks before old Corwin clapped me on the shoulder after a long day of hauling nets and said, "You work hard for a man who rides a warhorse." And I realized that was as close to acceptance as Brindleshore offered strangers. Wren was slower. She let me carry crates. She let me fix the hinge on her garden gate that had been sticking since winter. She answered my questions about her herbs, briefly, precisely, the way she had always answered questions, with the minimum information required and nothing more. She did not ask me questions in return. She did not mention Thornmere. I understood what she was doing. She was showing me her life, the one she had built without me, without a pack, without a king's protection. The cottage she had repaired with her own hands, the garden she had planted, the shop she had stocked through 2 years of learning herb craft from a village healer who had since passed away. The shelves of carefully labeled jars, the regular customers, the children who came to her door with scraped knees and bee stings because she was the closest thing Brindleshore had to a healer. She had built a life, a real one. Not the life of a records keeper in a king's court, invisible and unclaimed, but the life of a woman who had decided to be useful and had gone about it with the same quiet thoroughness she brought to everything. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and it terrified me because it proved what I had always suspected. She had never needed me. She had needed to be seen, to be valued, to be chosen, and when I had failed to do any of those things, she had simply done them for herself. One evening, 4 weeks after I arrived, I was sitting on the low stone wall behind the inn, watching the sun drop into the sea, when she appeared on the cliff path. She walked past me, then stopped. "How long are you staying?" she asked, not hostile, curious. "As long as you will let me." That is not an answer. It is the only one I have. She stood there for a moment, the wind pulling at her braid, the last of the sun catching the green stain on her fingers. Then she sat on the wall, 2 feet away from me, and looked at the sea. We sat in silence for a long time. The bond hummed low, warm, steady, and for the first time since I had arrived, she did not seem to be enduring my presence. She seemed to be allowing it. "The chamomile this year is the best I have grown," she said eventually. "The salt air does something to it." "I could smell it from the path," I said. "You could smell it because your senses are sharper than a normal man's, and you have been circling my garden like a wolf with a fixation." I could not help it, I almost laughed. She had always been like this, matter of fact, unimpressed by rank, precise in her observations. It was one of the things that had drawn me to her in the first place, before I had been too much of a fool to act on it. "Guilty," I said. She looked at me then, really looked, not the measuring glance or the guarded assessment, but the look I remembered from Thornmere, the one that had stopped me mid-sentence in my own hall. "Why did you come, Thuron?" I had rehearsed this answer 100 times on the road. I had prepared speeches, eloquent, kingly, persuasive. I discarded all of them. "Because the morning after you left," I said, "my wolf howled, not the way a wolf howls at the moon or at a loss. It was a sound I had never heard before, a grief sound, and it has not stopped. 3 years, Wren, every morning, every night, every hour I was not moving toward you, it howled. And I cannot live with that sound anymore, not because it is painful, though it is, because it is right. It is telling me the truth, and for 3 years I have been trying to catch up to a truth I should have recognized the first day you walked into my hall." She did not respond for a long time. The sea moved against the cliffs. A gull called somewhere below us. "That is a very pretty speech," she said quietly. "It is not a speech. It is what happened." "I know," she pulled at a thread on her sleeve. "That is what frightens me." She stood, brushed the stone dust from her skirt, and walked back toward her cottage. At the garden gate she paused. "You can come for tea tomorrow," she said. "After the shop closes, do not bring flowers, I grow my own." She went inside, and I sat on the wall until the stars came out, and the bond hummed so steady and warm that I could feel it in my teeth. I came for tea the next evening. No flowers. I brought a loaf of bread from the baker. Corwin's wife baked it, and it was the best bread I had eaten in years, and Wren accepted it with a nod and set it on the table and poured tea into 2 clay cups that did not match. Her cottage was small and impeccably organized. Every surface served a purpose, every object had a place. Books on a shelf above the hearth, herbalism texts, a volume of coastal tide tables, 3 novels with cracked spines that she had clearly read more than once. A narrow bed in the back room made with military precision. A kettle, a pot, 2 plates, 2 cups. She had not been expecting company, but she had always kept things ready, as though the world might change and she intended to be prepared. We sat at the table and drank tea, and she told me about Brindleshore. She told me about the healer who had taken her in, an old woman named Bridget, who had run the herbalist shop for 40 years, and who had recognized in Wren the same steady hands and sharp mind that had once organized a king's archives. Bridget had died the previous spring, and Wren had inherited the shop and the garden and the trust of a village that did not give trust easily. She told me about the cliff gardens, how the salt air and the southern light produced herbs with a potency you could not get inland, how she had learned to read the tides for seaweed that she dried and ground into poultice bases, how the fishermen brought her their injuries, and the mothers brought her their children's fevers, and the old men brought her their aching joints, and she treated them all with the same quiet thoroughness. She told me about the sea, how she had never seen it before she came south, and how the first time she stood on the cliff and watched the water move, she had understood something about scale, about how large the world was, and how small the court of Thornmere had been, and how she had been right to leave. I listened. I did not interrupt. I did not steer the conversation toward us, toward the bond, toward what I wanted. I listened because she was telling me who she had become, and I owed her that. When the tea was gone, she walked me to the door. "Same time tomorrow?" I asked. She looked at me for a long moment. "You are not very good at being patient, are you?" "I am learning." "Thursday," she said. "I am busy tomorrow." I came back on Thursday, and again the following Tuesday, and again 3 days after that. And each time the conversation went a little deeper, and the silences between us went a little warmer, and the bond hummed a little louder, and she let me stay a little longer. 6 weeks after I arrived in Brindleshore, she told me the truth. We were in her garden. She was pruning lavender, sharp, efficient cuts with a pair of iron shears that looked older than the village, and I was turning the soil in a bed she wanted to plant with rosemary. The afternoon was warm, the sea breeze steady, and we had fallen into a rhythm of working alongside each other that felt so natural it made my chest ache. "You did not lose me, Thuron." I looked up. She was not looking at me. She was looking at the lavender, her shears poised above a stem. "You set me aside," she said. "There is a difference." The words hit harder than I expected, perhaps because I had been waiting for them for 3 years, and I knew they were true. "A woman who is lost can be found," she said. "She is the object of the search. The story is about the person looking. But a woman who is set aside made a choice too. I chose to leave. I chose this village, this shop, this life. You did not lose me in a storm or a war. You looked at me and at a political alliance, and you decided which one was worth more. That was your right, but it means that finding me does not undo the choosing." She cut the lavender stem, clean, precise. "I know," I said. She looked at me then. "I set aside the only thing that mattered," I said, "because I was afraid of what it meant to need someone more than a crown. My counsel told me duty came first, and I believed them because it was easier than admitting that a records keeper with green-stained fingers had walked into my hall and made everything I had built feel insufficient. You did not fit the plan, Wren. You did not fit the alliance or the strategy or the careful future my advisors had drawn on their maps. You fit something else, something I did not have a word for, and I was not brave enough to choose it." The garden was quiet. A bee moved through the lavender. The sea murmured below the cliff. "That is the first honest thing you have ever said to me," she said. "I have said honest things before." "You have said true things. That is not the same. True things can be strategic. What you just said was not strategic. It cost you something." She set down her shears, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at me steadily. "I am not angry, Thuron. I was angry for about 6 months, the first 6 months, when I was walking south and sleeping in barns and wondering whether the ache in my chest was heartbreak or the bond or both. By the time I reached Brindleshore, the anger had burned through, and what was left was something more useful. What was left? Clarity. I know what I am worth. Not because you told me, you never told me, but because I built a life that proves it every day. This shop, this village, these people who come to my door because I can help them. That is what I am worth, and I will not trade it for a crown that should have been offered 3 years ago." I set down the trowel. I looked at her across the garden bed, in the late afternoon light, with lavender on the breeze and her hands stained green and her eyes as steady as they had been the day she walked into my hall. "I am not asking you to trade anything," I said. I am asking you to let me earn what I should have offered, however long that takes, on your terms, not mine. She held my gaze for a long time. You can start by finishing that rosemary bed, she said. You have been turning the same patch of soil for 20 minutes. I finished the rosemary bed. The weeks turned. Summer settled over Brindleshore like a warm hand, and I became a part of the village in the way that only useful strangers can, by working harder than anyone expected and asking for less. I mended the dock pilings when the spring storms loosened them. I helped Tess rethatch the inn's south wall. I carried the elder fisherman, a man named Holt, to Wren's shop when his knee gave out on the harbor steps, and I waited outside while she treated him, and when he came out leaning on a cane she had carved herself, he looked at me and said, "You are the king, are you not?" I looked at him. "I was a soldier for 30 years, Holt said. "I know the bearing. You carry yourself like a man who has led other men, and your horse is too fine for a tradesman." "I am the Alpha King of Thornmere," I said. There seemed no point in lying to a man who had already guessed. Holt considered this. "And you are here patching roofs and carrying flour." "Yes. For her. For her." He nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he had suspected. "She is the best thing that has happened to this village in 20 years, he said. "If you hurt her, there will not be a cliff high enough for you to hide on." "I know." "Good, help me to the harbor. My knee is better, but my pride is not." I helped him to the harbor. And that evening, when I sat on the stone wall behind the inn and watched the sun set, I realized that Brindleshore had given Wren something Thornmere never had. People who noticed her. People who valued her. People who would threaten a king on her behalf, not because of who she was to me, but because of who she was to them. I had never given her that. I had noticed her and then looked away. I had felt the bond and then chosen a trade route. I had let her be invisible in my own hall because it was easier than admitting what my wolf already knew. The shame of it sat in my stomach like a stone, and I let it sit because I deserved it. 2 months, the bond between us had become a living thing, not the howling ache of the search years, but something warmer and steadier. When we were near each other, working in the garden or sitting at her table or walking the cliff path in the evening, there was a warmth that moved between us like a current, a hum I could feel in my palms and behind my eyes. When she laughed, which was rare and always unexpected, and always at something precise and dry and devastatingly observant, the warmth flared, and my wolf went still in a way that I can only describe as reverence. She felt it too. I could tell by the way she paused sometimes, mid-sentence, and looked at her own hands as though expecting to find something written there. By the way she stood a little closer to me each week, not deliberately, not consciously, but in the way that water finds its level. By the way she said my name, not the king's name, not the title, just Thuron. And each time it sounded less like a boundary and more like a door left open. But she did not cross it, and I did not push. One evening, walking the cliff path as the stars came out, she said, "Tell me about Rivnah." I had been waiting for this question. What do you want to know? Was there any of it, any of the marriage, that was real? No, I said, not in the way you mean. Rivnah was capable and intelligent, and I respected her. But the bond was never there. She knew it before I did. She left because she was too proud to be the wife of a man whose wolf howled for someone else. Your wolf howled at night. Yes. And you let that happen. You lay beside a woman you had married, and your wolf called for another, and you let it happen. I did. That was cruel to Rivnah. It was. She walked in silence for a few steps. That is the part that makes it hard to trust you, she said. Not that you chose her over me. I understand duty, I understand strategy. I might even have forgiven it if the alliance had been necessary and the bond had been uncertain. But you knew. You knew what the bond was, and you married her anyway, and you let a good woman live beside a man who could not love her because his wolf was calling a name she could not hear. If you could do that to Rivnah, how do I know you would not do something equally selfish to me? I stopped walking. She stopped beside me. The cliff edge was 10 feet away, and the sea below was dark and moving. You do not know, I said. That is the truth. I cannot promise you that I have changed. I can only show you. I have been showing you for 2 months, and I will show you for as long as you need. But I will not stand here and tell you I am a better man than the one who married Rivnah, because the man who married Rivnah believed he was doing the right thing, and he was wrong. The only difference between him and me is that I know it. She looked at me for a long time. The wind moved through her hair, and the stars were out, and the bond hummed between us in the dark. That, she said quietly, is the second honest thing. We walked back to the village in silence, and at her garden gate she touched my hand, just the tips of her fingers against the back of my wrist, light and brief, and then she went inside. I stood at the gate until the lamp in her window went out, and the place where her fingers had touched my skin felt warm for hours. The trouble came in the 9th week. I had known it might. Brindleshore was a small village on an unprotected stretch of coast, and small unprotected places attract attention from those who have nothing to lose. A rogue pack called the Greymane had been raiding fishing villages along the southern shore for months, displaced wolves, leaderless, surviving by theft and intimidation. They had hit 2 villages east of Brindleshore in the previous season, taking supplies and livestock and leaving bruises and fear behind. I learned about the Greymane from Holt, who mentioned them over a mug of cider at the inn one evening with the studied casualness of a man who is not casual at all. They hit Saltmarsh last month, he said. Took their winter stores and 3 boats. The village could not stop them, no fighters, no alpha, no protection. How many in the pack? 12, maybe 15, led by a man called Rask, big mean, no rules. I looked at him. You are telling me this because you think they are coming here. I am telling you this because I think they are already watching. 2 strangers on the cliff rode yesterday, and they were not fishermen. I set down my mug. The bondache behind my ribs had shifted, not the warm hum of Wren's proximity, but something sharper. The wolf in me lifting its head, testing the wind. How many people in Brindleshore can fight? Fight, 6, maybe 8, if you count Tess, and she would be insulted if you did not. But none of us are soldiers, and none of us are wolves. You have 1 wolf, I said. Holt looked at me. 1 wolf against 15. 1 alpha king against 15 rogues, I said. The odds are different. I went to Wren's cottage that night. She opened the door and saw my face and said, "What happened?" I told her about the Greymane. I told her about Holt's report, about the strangers on the cliff road, about the pattern of raids along the coast. I told her what I thought was coming and when. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "What do you need?" Not what will you do, what do you need? The difference mattered. Time, I said. 2 or 3 days to prepare. The village needs a plan, and it needs to be your plan, not mine. They trust you. I can handle the fighting, but I cannot organize 30 families who do not know me. She nodded. She pulled a chair to the table, sat down, and said, "Tell me about the layout of the village relative to the approaches." We worked until midnight. She drew a map of Brindleshore from memory. Every house, every path, every garden wall, the harbor, the cliff approaches, the narrow lane between the inn and the bakery that was the only access from the eastern road. She marked the houses with children, the houses with elderly residents, the 3 cellars deep enough to shelter in. She listed resources, tools that could serve as weapons, rope, the fishing nets that could be strung across the lane. She was not afraid. That is what I remember most clearly about that night, not the planning, not the strategy, but the absolute absence of panic. She approached the threat the way she approached everything, with precision, with thoroughness, with the calm certainty that problems existed to be solved, and she was the person who would solve them. "I can make smoke blends," she said, tapping the map where the lane narrowed. "A mixture of wormwood, green pine, and dried moss, it produces a thick, disorienting smoke when burned. If we set fire baskets at the lane entrance and the harbor stairs, it will slow them and confuse their senses. You can make smoke that confuses wolf senses. I have been studying herbs for 3 years, Thuron. Some of them have very specific applications." I looked at her across the table in the lamplight with the map between us and her hands stained green and her eyes sharp and certain, and the bond in my chest did something it had never done before. It did not ache. It did not hum. It sang a single, clear note like a bell struck in a quiet room, and I knew with a certainty that went beyond instinct, beyond want, beyond the 3 years of searching, that this woman was not merely my fated mate. She was my equal. She had always been my equal. I had just been too blind to see it from a throne. "Tell me what you need me to do," I said. She handed me the map. "Start with the lane." We had 3 days. Wren organized the village with the same efficiency she had once brought to my archives. Every family assigned a role, every resource allocated, every contingency planned. She did not give orders. She gave information, and the village responded because they trusted her judgment. Holt and 3 other fishermen armed themselves with boat hooks and gutting knives. Tess strung fishing nets across the narrow lane, ankle height in the dark, enough to tangle anyone running through. Corwin, who, it turned out, had been a blacksmith's apprentice before he was a baker, sharpened every blade in the village and fashioned a pair of iron bars for the inn's front door. The mothers and children and elderly were moved to the deepest cellars with supplies and lanterns and instructions to stay until they heard 3-horn blasts, the all-clear signal. Wren made her smoke blends. She worked through the nights, grinding and mixing and packing the compounds into clay pots sealed with wax, and the cottage smelled of wormwood and pine and something sharp and green that burned the back of my throat when I came too close. "Do not inhale directly," she said, handing me a strip of linen soaked in peppermint oil. "Tie this over your nose and mouth when the pots are lit. It will not block everything, but it will keep your senses clear enough. And you. I will be on the cliff above the harbor stairs with a signal fire and a very large slingshot." "A slingshot?" "Holt made it. It fires clay pots with reasonable accuracy at 30 paces. I have been practicing." I stared at her. She looked back at me with perfect composure. "I am not a fighter, Thuron, but I can throw smoke into a choke point and I can signal an all clear, and I am not going to hide in a cellar while you stand alone in a lane. I do not want you in danger, and I do not want you dead." We seemed to be at an impasse. I opened my mouth to argue. She raised one eyebrow, a gesture so precise and devastating that my wolf, unbidden, tucked its ears and went quiet. "Fine," I said, "but you stay above the harbor stairs, not in the lane." "Agreed. Now help me seal these pots." The Greymen came on a night with no moon. They came from the eastern road, as we had expected, 14 of them, moving fast and quiet, expecting the same easy prey they had found at Saltmarsh. They did not expect fishing nets strung at ankle height in a dark lane. They did not expect clay pots that burst into choking, eye-stinging smoke that burned through their sharpened wolf senses like fire. And they did not expect an alpha king standing at the far end of the lane with a sword and 3 years of pent-up grief and rage, channeled into something cold and precise and very, very final. I will not describe the fight in detail. It was not beautiful, fights never are. It was fast and brutal and efficient, and I fought the way I had been trained, not as a king defending a territory, but as a wolf defending his mate's home. There is a difference. Territory is strategy, home is instinct. I did not think about flanking positions or tactical advantage. I thought about Wren on the cliff with her signal fire and her slingshot, and the bond sang in my chest, and my wolf surged forward, and the Greymen discovered what happens when 14 rogues with no alpha meet a king who has something he cannot lose again. 6 of them went down in the lane before the smoke cleared. 3 more at the harbor stairs, where Wren's pots burst at their feet and Holt and his fishermen met them with boat hooks and the grim competence of men who had hauled nets in storms for 30 years. 2 fled east along the cliff road and were not pursued. The remaining 3, including Rask, a heavy-shouldered man with scarred knuckles and the feral look of a wolf who had forgotten what a pack meant, cornered at the harbor wall. Rask looked at me. He was bleeding from a cut above his eye, breathing hard, and for a moment something almost like recognition crossed his face. "You are Thornmere," he said, "the Alpha King." "Yes." "You are a long way from your court." "I am exactly where I should be." He looked past me at the village, the lanterns coming on in windows, the villagers emerging from cellars and doorways, the fishing nets still tangled with groaning rogues in the lane. At Wren, standing on the cliff above the harbor stairs with the remains of a signal fire smoking behind her and her hands steady and her chin lifted. "For her," Rask said. "For all of them," I said, "but yes, for her." He set down his blade. His 2 remaining wolves did the same. I bound them, and we held them until morning, and at dawn we sent them north with their wounded and a message. Brindleshore was under the protection of the Alpha King of Thornmere, and anyone who returned would find more than smoke and fishing nets waiting. Wren found me sitting on the harbor wall after the Greymen had gone, in the first light of morning, with a slash across my ribs that I had not yet mentioned to anyone, because it was not deep, and because there were more important things. She sat beside me. She looked at the cut visible through the torn fabric of my shirt and said, "That needs stitching." "It is not deep." I did not ask if it was deep. I said it needs stitching. Come inside. I followed her to the cottage. She sat me at the table, heated water, and cleaned the wound with an efficiency that suggested she had done this many times, which, given 3 years as a village healer, she probably had. Her hands were warm on my skin, careful, precise, steady. She threaded a needle, and I watched her face as she worked, the concentration, the small furrow between her eyebrows, the way her lips pressed together when the needle went through. The bond sang. It was not the ache I had carried for 3 years, or the hum of proximity, or even the clear bell note from the night we planned the defense. It was something deeper and quieter and more certain, a warmth that started behind my ribs and spread outward, slow and steady, like a fire banked exactly right, like the sun clearing the horizon, like a door opening onto a room you had been looking for your whole life, and finding it exactly as warm and as right as you had imagined. She felt it too. I saw it in the way her hands stilled, the needle poised above the last stitch, in the way her breath caught, in the way she looked down at her own wrist and saw what I saw in the same moment. A mark, warm bronze, the color of old honey in sunlight. It bloomed on her wrist like a brushstroke, slowly, gently, without pain or flash, as though it had always been there and was simply choosing this moment to make itself visible. And on my wrist, the same mark, the same bronze, the same warmth. The bond mark, 3 years late and exactly on time. She set down the needle. She touched the mark on her wrist with one fingertip, tracing its edge. Then she looked at mine. "Thuron," she said. "I know. This is... Yes." She was quiet for a long time. The morning light was coming through the cottage window, warm and golden, catching the jars of herbs on their shelves and the lavender hanging from the ceiling beams and the mark on her wrist, glowing faintly. "It chose now," she said. "Why now?" "I thought about this. Because I was not fighting for Thornmere last night," I said. "I was not fighting for a kingdom or an alliance or a strategic advantage. I was fighting for your home, the place you built, the people you chose. For the first time in my life, I was not the alpha king protecting his territory. I was a man protecting the thing he loves. Maybe the bond needed to see that. Maybe I needed to see it." She looked at me. Her eyes were bright, and for the first time since I had found her in Brindleshore, the steadiness in her gaze was not a wall. It was a foundation. "I am not going back to Thornmere as a replacement," she said. "I know. I am not going to be the woman your court whispers about, the records keeper you settled for after the real match failed. No, you will be the woman I should have chosen from the first, and anyone who whispers otherwise will answer to me. I will answer for myself, thank you." I almost smiled. "I know that too." She finished the last stitch. She tied it off, cut the thread, and smoothed a poultice over the wound that smelled of calendula and honey. Then she looked at me across the table, in the morning light, with the bond mark warm on both our wrists and the smell of smoke and lavender in the air. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me." "I will come to Thornmere, but the herbalist shop stays open here. Tess can run it. I have been training her. I will not abandon what I built." "Done. Your council will treat me as your equal, not as a project they need to manage. If Halden condescends to me, I will organize his office into a system so efficient he will never find anything again. He probably deserves it. And you will never, never set me aside again. Not for a treaty, not for an alliance, not for anything. If you are going to choose me completely. I have had enough of being the thing a king considers and then sets down." I reached across the table. I took her hand, carefully, gently, the way you hold something you have spent 3 years learning you cannot live without. "I choose you," I said, "completely. Not because my wolf howled for 3 years, not because the bond mark chose this morning, not because you are brilliant and brave and the most competent person I have ever met, although you are all of those things. I choose you because you walked away from a king without begging and built a life that put his court to shame, and I have never admired anyone the way I admire you. I will not set you aside. I will not look away. I will spend every day of whatever years we have proving that I am the man who deserves to stand at your door." Her hand tightened on mine. The bond mark pulsed, warm bronze, steady, certain, and for the first time her eyes were not steady. They were bright, and something moved behind them that I had never seen before, and it looked like the thing I had been carrying in my own chest for 3 years. "Then stay for breakfast," she said, "and stop bleeding on my table." We left for Thornmere 3 weeks later. Not because I rushed her, because she was ready. She spent those weeks training Tess to run the herbalist shop, organizing the inventory, writing instructions for every herb and remedy on the shelves in her careful, slanted handwriting. She said goodbye to every family in the village individually. She sat with Holt on the harbor wall and they talked for 2 hours, and when she came back her eyes were red but her chin was up and her back was straight. She packed lightly. The leather satchel she had carried from Thornmere 3 years ago, now filled with dried herbs instead of ledgers, a bundle of books. The pair of iron shears from the garden. Nothing from the life she had built. She left it all for Tess and the village, except the things that were truly hers. Her knowledge, her hands, her quiet certainty. I sent a rider ahead, not with the king's full escort and not with a herald's announcement, with a letter. To Haldon, 3 lines, I am coming home. I am bringing someone. Prepare the records room. We rode into Thornmere on a clear morning in early autumn, and the court that had once overlooked a records keeper saw something different in the woman who rode beside their king. Perhaps it was the bond mark on her wrist, visible and unmistakable. Perhaps it was the way I looked at her. Perhaps it was the way she looked at them. Not with deference, not with challenge, but with the quiet authority of a woman who had run a village through a raid and organized a king through a crisis, and was not particularly impressed by a stone hall. Haldon met us at the gate. He looked at Wren. He looked at the bond mark. He looked at me. "My king," he said, "welcome home." "Haldon," Wren said, with a nod exactly as brief as the one she had given 3 years ago. I noticed on my way out that the trade ledgers for the eastern provinces were misfiled by a full calendar year. I trust someone corrected that. Haldon opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "No one corrected it," he said. "I will start tomorrow," she said, and walked past him into the hall. Haldon looked at me. I looked at Haldon. She is my mate, my Luna. And if you tell me one more time that the bond chooses when it chooses, I will let her reorganize your entire office." He went pale. I have never seen a man submit so quickly. She did not want a ceremony. I offered one, a formal claiming before the pack, the kind of public declaration the Niche's old stories always build toward, and she looked at me with the expression she reserved for suggestions that were technically correct but fundamentally unnecessary. "The mark is on both of our wrists," she said. "Anyone who needs a ceremony to believe it is welcome to look at the trade ledgers I fixed in 3 days and draw their own conclusions about who runs this court." She was not wrong, but the court saw anyway. They saw the bond mark, warm bronze on both our wrists, visible every time she reached for a ledger or I rested my hand on the council table. They saw the way I listened when she spoke, which was the way a man listens when the voice in the room is the smartest one. They saw the way she moved through the hall, not as a guest, not as an ornament, but as a woman who knew where every record was filed and how every system worked, and who was not afraid to say so. And they saw my wolf. My wolf had been silent for 3 years, silent and restless, and howling only in the deep hours of the night when no one could hear. Now it was quiet in a different way. Settled, the way a river is quiet when it finds the sea. The pack felt it, that deep, bone-level certainty that their alpha was whole, that the bond was fulfilled, that the howling was done. The council bowed to her within a week, not because I ordered it. Because she had reorganized the archive, fixed the trade discrepancy, identified a supply chain problem in the eastern provinces that had been costing us 1/10 of our grain, and done it all before anyone thought to ask. Holt came to visit at midwinter. He stood in the great hall and looked around and said, "Not bad, needs better bread." Wren laughed. It was the first time the court had heard her laugh, and every wolf in the hall went still, not the stillness of fear, but the stillness of something clicking into place. There is a moment I return to. Not the fight, though I carry that too, the weight of the sword and the smoke and the certainty that I would die before I let the Greymane touch her village. Not the bond mark appearing, though that morning in her cottage, with the needle and the honey poultice and the bronze light blooming on our wrists, is the morning I will remember when every other memory has gone. The moment I return to is smaller than either of those. It was a week after we arrived at Thornmere. I came to the records room looking for a supply report, and I found her at her old desk, the same desk she had left 3 years ago, the same window with the good light, the same smooth river stone she had weighted her farewell note with which I had kept in my study drawer for 3 years and which she had found without comment and placed back on the desk where it belonged. She was reading a ledger. Her sleeves were pushed past her elbows and her hands were stained green. She had been in the castle's neglected herb garden that morning, assessing what could be salvaged, and she did not look up when I came in. I stood in the doorway and I watched her, and the bond hummed, low and warm and steady, and my wolf was quiet, and the hall smelled of stone and candle smoke and lavender, and I understood that this was what I had been searching for across 3 years and 1,000 miles of road. Not a mate, not a Luna, not a political asset or a bond fulfilled. Her, Wren. The woman who had walked into my hall carrying ledgers and walked out carrying nothing but her dignity, and who had built a life so complete that a king had to learn to carry crates before she would let him through her door. She looked up. "Stop standing in doorways," she said. "Either come in or go away." I came in. I sat in the chair across from her desk, and she handed me a stack of misfiled grain reports, and we worked in silence until the candles burned low, and when we walked to our rooms, her hand in mine, the bond mark warm on both our wrists, the hall quiet around us, she said, "The Eastern Province grain numbers are worse than I thought." "How bad?" "Bad enough that I will need the rest of the week. Also, your steward has been using the wrong conversion for bushels for at least 2 years." "Should I speak to him?" "I already did. He took it well." I looked at her. How well? He went slightly pale and asked if I would like a cup of tea. I said yes. We came to an understanding. She squeezed my hand, brief, precise, warm, and went into her room, and I stood in the hallway of my own castle and felt, for the first time in 6 years as Alpha King, that Thornmere was home. Not because of the stone walls or the oak beams or the throne I sat in every morning. Because of the smell of lavender in the records room and the green stains on her fingers, and the way she said my name, just Thuron, no title, no rank, as though a king were simply a man, and a man were enough. I keep her note in my desk drawer still. 5 words in her careful, slanted hand. "I wish you well, my king." She knows it is there. She has never asked me to throw it away. I think she understands what I understand, that it is not a reminder of the leaving. It is a reminder of what it cost me to be the kind of man she had to leave, and what it earned me to become the kind of man she was willing to come back to. The bond mark on my wrist is warm as I write this. It is always warm. 3 years of aching, and now it is warm and steady and certain, and it does not howl. She is in the records room. She is always in the records room. And I am going to bring her tea, because it is late and she forgets, and because bringing tea to the woman who rebuilt your kingdom with a stack of ledgers and a pair of iron shears is the least a man can do, even if he is a king. Especially if he is a king.